Hello and welcome. Tonight we drift back into a world shaped by ritual, rhythm, and the gentle weight of centuries. As you settle into rest, allow your thoughts to quiet, your breath to soften. Let the world around you blur as we journey together into a place where the lanterns glow softly in the mist, where sandals scrape against wooden planks, and where life moves to the measured cadence of seasons and ceremony. This is Edo, Tokugawa, Japan's grand. Bustling capital land, orderly chaos of narrow streets, woodblock prints, and shogunal silence. It was a city of almost 1 million people at its peak in the 18th century, one of the largest cities in the world. But for all its beauty and sophistication, the city ran on the backsand, beneath the feet of laborers who toiled in darkness and filth. In tonight's journey, we begin with the world of those whose task it was to manage Edo's waste members of the humble yet essential sewer guilds. From there, we meet an unusual samurai who dared to defy class expectations before wandering through a curious historical mystery hidden in a festival of fire. And finally, we ascend gently into the life of the elite, to the stillness behind the walls of the shoguness palace. So now, close your eyes if you haven't already. Breathe. Let go of the day. Imagine yourself in Edo. Before the daylight stirs and the markets open. Before the chanted calls of vendors echo across the riverbanks. Before sandals shuffle along alleyways and hurried morning footsteps. There is a quietness. It's not silence, exactly, but a softness. The kind of quiet that settles over a sleeping city. A stillness of suspended breath. And in this suspended moment, if you find yourself standing in a narrow street in Old Edo, just before the lanterns are taken down, and just after the stars begin to fade, you might catch a glimpse of a different kind of rhythm, not the thunder of kabuki drums, not the clatter of tea-house porcelain, but the slow, purposeful footsteps of men in plain clothing, carrying tools that are worn smooth with use. They do not look important. Their sandals are patched, their shoulders bowed, but they are the ones who kept the city from drowning in its own refuse. They are the keepers of what everyone produces and no one wishes to name. These are the night soil collectors of Edo. And though they moved in shadows, history moved because of them. City that shouldn't have worked, let us begin with the city itself. Edo, known today as Tokyo, was not meant to be so large. It began as a small fishing village, humble, quiet, tucked between sea and hill. But in 1603, with the rise of the Tokugawa shogunate, Edo became the seat of power for the military government. It grew and grew. And grew. By the early 1700s, it was among the largest cities in the world, perhaps the largest, with more than 1 million people living between its wooden walls. A wooden city with wooden houses, wooden bridges, wooden markets. A wooden castle rising over a moat that reflected nothing but cloud and carp. Imagine a city that dense, with no plumbing. No sewers, as we understand them. No electric pumps or underground treatment plants. And yet Edo was remarkably clean. Fewer plagues than in European cities. Lower rates of cholera. Less filth in the streets. How? Through the strange miracle of cooperation, guild labor, and one of the most sophisticated waste recycling systems the pre-modern world had ever seen. The heart of it all. The Shimogo Toritha takers of what was left behind. The bucket beneath the floorboards. To understand the work, you must understand the toilet. The typical home in Edo did not have a flush toilet. There was no porcelain throne, no tiled washroom, no gleaming pipes leading downward. Instead, beneath the house, beneath wooden floorboards, or in a detached structure out back, there sat a bucket. Sometimes tall and round, sometimes wide and low, but always simple. Made of wood, with slats bound tightly by iron or rope. Watertight, but barely. This bucket, called a benjo okwiz, shared by the household. In long houses, where many families shared a dwelling, there might be one toilet for every few apartments. In wealthier homes, they might be cleaner, more discreet. But the principle was the same. There was no sewer to flush into. The bucket filled, slowly, daily, inevitably, and then someone had to take it away, not discard it, not bury it, but collect it, reuse it, sell it. In Edo, waste was not waste. It was fuel for rice. A city of farmers and fertilizer, Japan, in the Tokugawa era, was a nation deeply connected to agriculture. Rice was not only food, but currency. The wealth of a domain was measured in kokua unit, representing the amount of rice needed to feed one person for a year. Rice was life. But rice is demanding. It leaches nutrients from the soil. And so, after every harvest, the land must be fed again. In the countryside, that meant compost, ash, animal dung. But in cities, Edo, it meant night soil. Thud. The term is polite, deliberately vague. Night soil suggests something mysterious, perhaps earthy, perhaps romantic. But what it refers to is human waste. Carefully gathered, sold, and returned to the land. It was valuable. A single household's waste over the course of a month might earn several Moncopper coins. Some landlords included the value of their tenants' waste in rent calculations. Farmers from outside the city would compete for contracts. The night soil men would make deliveries to nearby villages, barrels sloshing. Some even stored the material for seasons, waiting for the highest prices. And in this strange economy, Edo achieved a kind of ecological balance few modern cities can match. What came from the land was returned to it. What was eaten became nourishment again. Nothing was wasted, especially waste. The men who carried it let us now walk with them. You are standing in an alleyway before the dawn. You hear the slow creak of a wooden yoke, soft grunt as a man balances twin buckets, one on each side. His coat is short, tied up for mobility. His head is wrapped in cloth, more for dust and smell than for fashion. His hands are rough, his sandals muddy, but he moves like a professional. This is not clumsiness. This is trained efficiency. He walks slowly but surely. The load he carries is heavy, perhaps 70 or 80 pounds per side. He pauses at the next house, sets the buckets down, reaches beneath the porch, where the household's waste bucket waits. He empties it into his own container. Gently, deliberately, avoiding splashes, avoiding sound, he rinses. He replaces the lid, and then he moves on. He will do this perhaps 50 or 60 times before the sun rises fully. There are many like him, dozens, hundreds, all moving through the city with the same quiet rhythm. They are anonymous. It's unseen by the samurai, who sleep in their compounds. It's unspoken of by the women arranging tea ceremonies. But without them, the city would falter. Without them, the streets would overflow. And yet, few would thank them. Names in the shadows. The Shimogo Guilds, in Edo's elaborate web of urban labor. Few occupations were more essential or more quietly regulated than the handling of human waste. This was not uncoordinated work. It was part of a system, a profession, and in its own way, a guild. The men who managed the city's refuse were generally organized into associations, sometimes formal, sometimes informal, known as Shimogo, Nakama literally, the night soil comrades. These were tight-knit groups often assigned to specific districts or wards, responsible for the collection, transport, and sale of the waste within their territory. Each guild had its own structure. There was often a leader called a Kashirahu, coordinated schedules, handled negotiations with farmers, and ensured that routes did not overlap. Beneath him, journeymen and apprentices worked in pairs or alone. Depending on their experience and the density of the neighborhood, apprenticeship began young, often by one's early teens. Sons of collectors would naturally take after their fathers, but outsiders could be brought in too, usually through marriage or family recommendation. It was a career passed down, not chosen lightly. Unlike the more glamorous guilds, those of the carpenters, the sword polishers, the lacquerware artists, the night soil guilds were rarely mentioned in celebratory poems or civic festivals, and yet they had their rituals. Small ceremonies for new members, shared meals at seasonal milestones. A few even kept wooden tablets where the names of past members were recorded, quietly, with brush and ink. Though their hands carried what others left behind, their community carried its own quiet dignity. The tools of their trade, their tools were simple. There was the yoke, a sturdy pole carried over the shoulders, balanced with buckets or barrels at either end. These yokes were shaped to curve gently, easing the strain on bones and tendons, padded in places with tightly wound cloth. There were the buckets themselves, cylindrical or squared, reinforced with iron bands. Some had wooden lids secured with rope to prevent spillage on rough streets. For cleaning, there were ladles, bamboo scoops, and ash used to suppress odor and absorb liquid. Lime was expensive and rare. Ash was the more practical companion. The scent of scorched wood became part of the trade, a faint cloak for more powerful smells. Collectors also carried a register either in their mind, or, more rarely in paper form, of which households had been visited, how much had been collected, and whether any payment, in coin or credit, was due. There were no uniforms, but a few guilds adopted colored sashes or markings on the back of their coat symbols, not worn for status, but for safety, in case of accident, in case someone slipped into the canal, in case someone did not come home. The weight of the load, the physical toll of the work cannot be overstated. Each morning, the men began their routes well before sunrise. The city was dense, its alleys narrow and uneven. In summer, the air was thick with moisture and insects. In winter, the ground was hard, icy, and dangerous. They lifted, they balanced, they walked, over bridges, downstairs, through markets not yet awake. Every step required control. To stumble was not just to spill, was to shame oneself, one's guild, one's entire livelihood, and so they learned to walk a certain way, knees slightly bent, shoulders forward, steps short but steady. They developed a rhythm left, right, balance, pause. The yoke moved with them like an extension of the spine. Many suffered from joint pain, muscle cramps, and early degeneration of the knees and back. There were no doctors for laborers. There was only rest, herbal compresses, and the soothing heat of bathhouses when they could afford to go. Their days were not long, but they were intensely physical. Single shift could exhaust even the most seasoned worker. Danger in the quiet, although rarely spoken of, the work carried real risks. Disease was an ever-present threat. While Ito's system prevented mass outbreaks, the handlers themselves were constantly exposed. Their skin was in contact with contaminated wood and rope. A small cut could fester. A cough could spread. Some collectors wore scarves soaked in vinegar, believing it purified the air. Others chewed on leaves or roots for the same effect. These were folk remedies, comforts of belief, but they helped. There were other dangers too, bandits, especially on the outskirts of town. Buckets of night soil were rarely robbed, but carts were sometimes raided for the copper payments they carried. Then there were accidents. A misstep on a wet bridge. A cracked yoke during a steep descent. A fall into the very canals they helped keep clean. In the quietest hours, there was the danger of simply not being seen. In a world that did not want to acknowledge them, the risk of invisibility was very real. Unseen and untouchable to many in Ito, the night soil collectors were a necessary presence, but also a troubling one. Despite their contribution to public health and agricultural wealth, they were often associated with uncleanness, both physical and spiritual. In Tokugawa society, influenced by both Buddhist and Shinto notions of purity, those who handled death, leather, or excrement were often placed into hereditary social outcast categories. Known historically as Ida or Heinen words, now considered offensive, but at the time used in official registers. Not all night soil workers belonged to these castes. Some were peasants supplementing income, others were tradesmen by necessity. The stigma lingered, who were rarely invited to public festivals. Their marriages were sometimes restricted. Their children might face discrimination in schools or apprenticeships, and yet among themselves there was community. They married within their guilds. They held feasts after long harvest seasons. They helped one another during illness. They taught their sons the roots, and their daughters the business of negotiation. In a city that turned its nose away from them, they turned inward and built a culture of mutual respect. The journey beyond the city as dawn crept over Ito. The collectors' rounds would near their end. Streets began to fill with early vendors, shopkeepers unlatching wooden shutters, and the soft clack of sandals against cobblestone. But the labor of the Night Soil Guild was not yet done. What they carried on their shoulders in sloshing buckets and carefully tied barrels still had a destination. Their destination was often the city's edge quiet, sprawling zones where the clamor of Edo gave way to narrow farm plots and sloping paths. Here, the rhythm of life slowed. Here, the soil waited. Some guilds stored their collected waste temporarily in holding basins, simple wooden tanks built in discreet courtyards or behind warehouses. These basins were stirred occasionally, letting the contents settle and mature an early form of composting, though the term had not yet been used. Other guilds transported it immediately, guiding their carts out of town in the very early light before the smell became too pungent under the rising sun. Collectors would follow the same dirt tracks day after day, month after month. Some routes led southeast toward rice-growing districts along the Sumida River. Others went west, toward vegetable fields near Koichikawa. The same paths, the same farmers, the same delicate negotiations, the currency of crops. It may be surprising to learn that in Edo, Japan, human waste was not simply dumped, was bought and sold. And at times, it was fiercely contested. Farmers paid for night soil. It's not out of charity or obligation, but because it was a proven source of nutrient-rich fertilizer. Crops nourished by human waste, especially rice, soybeans, and leafy greens, yielded better harvests. There was a clear logic, a dependable rhythm to the entire cycle. Urban citizens ate the food. They produced the waste. That waste was collected, fermented, transported, and spread on rural fields, and from those fields came the next harvest. In this way, waste became currency. A city fed the country. The country, in turn, fed the city. Contracts were struck between sewer guilds and farming families, often seasonally. The best districts, those with the wealthiest, most protein-rich waste, commanded higher prices. Areas with restaurants and inns were particularly valued. Even samurai quarters had a certain desirability, though collectors were required to navigate. Extra layers of etiquette and restrictions. Disputes sometimes arose. Farmers occasionally offered better deals to rival guilds. Some residents attempted to sell their waste privately. Others refused to allow collectors in at all, hoping to cut out the middleman. Guilds defended their turf. Elders met to resolve grievances. Sometimes they fought not with weapons, but with paperwork, silence, or slow-moving sabotage. All of it over what many considered worthless. Contracts, barrels, and gentle negotiation, though informal by modern standards, these waste contracts were binding social agreements. Often accompanied by tokens of trust, seasonal gifts, shared meals, and face-to-face conversation. Some were even written out in ink, on folding paper, and signed with thumbprints or personal seals. Collectors would track which farmers took which loads. They might differentiate between fresh waste and semi-composted slurry. In lean times, they might offer credit. In bountiful seasons, they might collect an extra coin or two. Certain guilds grew known for honesty, others for speed, still others for quiet discretion. Over time, reputations became as valuable as the barrels themselves. A farmer might say, the Ueno group brings the best summer mix. Another might insist the Janaka men stir their batches. They don't leave it raw. Even in refuse, there were distinctions, classifications, expectations, and always negotiation. A system compared Edo and Europe to fully appreciate the refinement of Edo's night soil system. One must look briefly across the seas. In the 17th and 18th centuries, many European cities, London, Paris, Naples, struggled to manage the filth of growing urban populations. Waste ran in gutters. Chamber pots were emptied from upper windows with little warning. The Thames and the Seine became repositories of everything the body no longer needed. In some places, public latrines were little more than pits of stench and danger. By contrast, Edo's system, though imperfect, was a marvel of efficiency, recycling, and low-cost maintenance. The very fact that waste was valuable meant it was removed regularly. There was incentive. There was profit. There was care. While cholera tore through European streets in waves, Edo remained relatively untouched. Though it would not understand the microbial reasons for centuries, its people had stumbled upon a model of public health through private labor. And it was all carried literally on the shoulders of men whom society refused to meet in the eye. The smell of sustenance. It is easy to imagine Edo as a clean place. In many ways it was. No open sewers, no trash-choked canals. But the air still carried a scent. especially near the edges of town. The scent was earthy, acrid, sour, not overwhelming but unmistakable. Farmers claimed to smell the life in it. Some said it reminded them of freshly turned soil after rain. Children grew used to it. Vendors ignored it. Dogs trailed behind carts, hopeful for scraps. And the collectors, those most accustomed to it, barely noticed. Their sense of smell adapted, their breathing adjusted. Their thoughts turned to more practical concerns. Would the barrels hold? Would the farmer pay in coin or beans? Would the rains make the road impassable? And so, the scent, offensive to some, invisible to others, became part of the city's texture. An undercurrent, a quiet presence. Like the hum of insects, or the creak of floorboards at night. Labor, stigma, and pride. The paradox of Edo's sewer collectors was this: they were indispensable and disregarded in equal measure. Without them, disease would rise, markets would suffer, farmers would struggle. But because they touched what others would not, they were kept at arm's length. And yet, in their own way, many were quietly proud. They knew their roots and knew their clients. They could walk an alley blindfolded. They could judge a household's health by the weight of a bucket. They were men of rhythm, men of habit, men who understood the body's forgotten language. Some even carved insignias into their bucket handles, small designs, initials, or symbols that would outlast them. A way to leave a mark. Most left no grave markers, no official biographies. But they left cleaner streets, fuller harvests, and a system so effective it took the collapse of Edo itself to dismantle it. The gentle fade. By the late 1800s, the system began to fade. Westernization brought new attitudes. Flush toilets appeared. Sanitation became the domain of science, not guild. Many of the old collectors were displaced. Some found work in new departments. Others drifted to smaller towns or into poverty. Their guilds vanished, their names forgotten. But for over 2 centuries, they had held Edo together quietly, patiently, with balance and care. In the end, the rhythm of their work step, pause, breath, balance, became the rhythm of the city itself. You've now walked through the unseen alleys of Edo, behind the curtained doors of its laborers, into the soft stink and steady cadence of a world rarely remembered. Next, we will rise from the underbelly of the city and into the lights of the stage. Let us begin again. Gently. The way one walks through rice fields in early spring, watching the water ripple beneath the seedlings, listening to the wind rustling bamboo groves. Imagine Edo, not the metropolis of neon and steel that would rise centuries later, but a growing city of wooden buildings, tiled roofs, and winding canals. It is the year 1660, and somewhere among the quiet alleyways of this burgeoning capital, a child is born. His name, Horikoshi Shinosuke. You would not know it then, of course, as the midwife cleans the child and his mother rests beneath paper screens. But this boy, small, dark-eyed, the son of a man with few prospects, will one day be known across the city by a different name, a stage name that will reverberate through history. Ichikawa de Nandro, the first of his line. The beginning of something bold that is far in the future. For now, the child rests. Let's remain here a little while longer, with the gentle hush of a home not yet stirred by legend. Let us consider the world he was born into. Shape of the city Edo in the 1660s was no longer a town, it was a force. The Tokugawa shogunate had already declared it the administrative heart of Japan, and it was swelling with people's samurai in the upper wards, artisans and merchants in the low-lying commoner districts. It was a city built on social order and strict rules, but also on movement, noise, and change. At the edges of the city, the Sumida River curved like a lazy spine, and near its banks, a different kind of world pulsed. This was the Ukiotha, floating world, a space of entertainment, art, and indulgence. It was in this liminal space, neither sacred nor profane, but suspended, that kabuki theater took root. And it was into this floating world that Shinosuke would grow. From sword to stage, Shinosuke's father was a man of samurai origins, but uncertain means. Many men of lower-ranking samurai descent, lacking stipends or appointments, sought work in the trade, some as scribes, others as guards, and a few more daringly. In the theater, it is believed that Shinosuke's father found his way to the stage, not as a performer perhaps, but connected to its backstage workings. He brought his son with him, not for glory, but likely for simple sustenance. The theater offered rice, coin, maybe a future. The boy watched. The plodding of feet behind curtains, careful preparation of costumes. The rehearsed movements of the actors, some fluid, some stiff. He memorized their rhythms. He listened to how they spoke. At the age of 13, he made his debut. It was not a spectacular affair. No trumpets, no fanfare. But those in the small audience who had eyes to see and ears to hear knew. There was something there. A spark. A centeredness. The boy moved with certainty, not like someone pretending to be a hero, but like someone becoming one. The birth of Arigoto, a few years later, in 1673, everything changed. Now performing under the name Ichikawa D'Andro, the teenage actor introduced a style that Ito had never quite seen before. He called it Arigoto, rough style. Where other actors had favored grace, subtlety, or flirtation, D'Andro offered power. His gestures were broad, his voice thunderous, his costumes massive. His roles, warriors, demons, gods. And in each of these, he moved not like a man acting, but like a storm made flesh. Audiences were awestruck. This was kabuki as ritual, as revelation. The kabuki of bloodline and bravado. The hero did not merely win the fight. He stared down evil with eyes rimmed in red and forced fate itself to yield. And always, always, it was D'Andro at the center, holding a moment. Let's pause, just for a while, and dwell on a single technique. The me. This is the dramatic pose struck by an actor at the height of emotional tension. Time seems to stop. The actor freezes eyes wide, legs spread, fingers curved like claws or swords. The music swells, the air tightens. To hold a me well requires not only physical control, but emotional gravity. D'Andro did not invent the me, but he mastered it. In his hands, it became a pause of thunder, a second that stretched, that seared itself into memory. You can still see it today, in the ink of old woodblock prints. A single freeze frame of rage, or justice, or sacred fury. In that moment, D'Andro was no longer himself. He was icon. The audience that shouted the theater districts of Ito were not quiet. During D'Andro's time, kabuki was an all-day event. Audiences arrived early with bento boxes, cushions, and their favorite fans. They shouted their favorite actors' names mid-scene, a practice known as keiko. The loudest cries were saved for D'Andro, Ichino-dan. They would yell, "Dan-sama." Didn't merely draw crowds, he drew devotion. Women adorned themselves in kabuki-inspired patterns. Merchants commissioned prints of his face. Children recited his lines with the seriousness of students learning sutras. In the noise, he remained still. In the stillness, he commanded noise. The sacred and the profane, though kabuki was considered secular entertainment, D'Andro infused it with spiritual symbolism. He often portrayed Fudumeo, the Buddhist deity of fire and wrath, protector of sacred law. Wrapped in flame-colored robes, wielding weapons both real and metaphorical, D'Andro blurred the lines between play and prayer. He turned the kabuki stage into a sanctified battlefield. And still, he remained a man. He had debts, rivalries, family duties. He married. He trained his son Ichikawa D'Andro, too, with what many considered cruel rigor. He drank, perhaps too much. He made enemies. One of them, an actor jealous or wounded or both, would one day come for him in the dark. But we will return to that. In this part, we set the stage as this first part of our long, quiet journey through D'Andro's life draws to a close. Let us reflect on what we've glimpsed. A child born in uncertain times. A city alive with change. Stage transformed by force of presence. Ichikawa D'Andro. I did not merely perform in kabuki, he became kabuki. And yet the story is far from complete. Imagine yourself now in the very heart of Ito's theater district, Nakamuraza. The playbills flap like banners in a summer breeze, thick black ink promising heroic drama and righteous revenge. The scent of grilled soy and inked parchment wafts through narrow alleyways. Children imitate warrior poses. Merchants haggle over front row seats. At the center of it all is one name, Dandro. The theater, as a city within a city by the 1680s, Kabuki theater had become not just a popular pastime, but a social institution. The shogunate tolerated it, but barely. They saw Kabuki as decadent, noisy, morally ambiguous. Its actors, though beloved, were often treated legally as outcast Skawaramono, the same status as tanners and gravediggers. But among the common people, Deandro was more than human. He was myth and man. He moved through the streets, shrouded in layers of meaning. Some followed his fashion, others his philosophy. Movements, once rough and raw, now carried ritual grace. As he matured, so did his style. He began to blend arigoto with religious ceremony. The gestures became less about shock and more about invoking divine presence. A slash of the sword became a prayer, shout, a purifying flame. In one play, he reenacted the dance of a god descending from heaven. In another, he stood center stage for 3 silent minutes while smoke curled around him, the audience holding their breath as if before an altar. They did not call this acting. They called it living kami, living God. Fudo Mio, in the Theater of Fire, the role most synonymous with Deandro, was not a human at all, but a Buddhist deity, Fudo Mioth, the immovable wisdom king, a fierce protector, always shown with a scowl. Flames swirling behind him, sword in one hand and rope in the other. For Deandro, portraying Fudo Mio was not a role, it was a calling. He treated the part with spiritual gravity. He fasted before performances. He abstained from meat. He purified the stage with salt. For him, the transformation into Fudo was a kind of channeling, not performance, but presence. He would emerge from behind a painted curtain, eyes rimmed in red, face coated in thick white Oshiroi powder. His voice would ring out low, resonant, filled with barely restrained violence. I burn away ignorance. I bind the unbound. The effect on the crowd was electric. Even hardened gamblers bowed their heads. Children wept without understanding why. Priests, wary of Kabuki's secular leanings, nevertheless nodded. He had become flame-given voice. Behind the curtain, tensions in the dressing room and yet off stage, the world was not flame but fog. Fame, even in the floating world, was a heavy thing. Deandro was no longer a boy from a poor family. He was a celebrity, and with that came attention he did not always want. Other actors resented him. Its innovations were seen by some as blasphemous and impure mix of religious symbolism and common entertainment. Others envied the loyalty of his audience, especially the women who threw handkerchiefs and secret letters onto the stage after every show. Some say he was cold backstage, reserved, distant. He rarely mingled. He kept a personal shrine in his dressing room. He preferred solitude to celebration. He trained his son Ichikawa Deandro too with near military discipline. The boy, just 7 or 8, would recite lines for hours, repeat gestures under the unforgiving eye of his father. Again, Deandro would say slower, with fire, and when the boy succeeded, the reward was silence. The enemy within the guild, but the theater was not a monastery, it was full of rivalries. One of his most bitter rivals was the actor Ikushima Shingoro, known for his elegant, effeminate roles, the very opposite of Deandro's thundering warriors. The two represented not just different styles, but different worldviews. Audiences chose sides. Some adored Deandro's masculinity, his religious symbolism, his loud, righteous heroes. Others preferred Shingoro's soft-spoken elegance, his romantic delicacy, his graceful glances. When the two shared a play, the tension was visible. Some said they avoided speaking entirely off stage. Others whispered of pranks, sabotage, or threats made in dressing rooms. If the floating world could be as cutthroat as court politics, the unseen burden. All the while, Deandro grew heavier, not just in body, but in presence. He was no longer just an actor. He was the head of a lineage, a standard-bearer for Kabuki itself. Every movement had to be perfect. Every performance, transcendent. Every appearance in public, a ritual. He began speaking less, smiling less, made new enemies, not just among actors, but among the censors. Kabuki was always dancing on the edge of acceptability. The shogunate's moral police considered it dangerous. Plays that mocked authority or promoted rebellion were banned. Scripts had to be reviewed. Actors were fined or worse. Danju Roes, blending of religious imagery with entertainment, drew criticism. Some accused him of impiety, of turning sacred symbols into ticket sales. He defended himself with calm words, "I act for the people. I offer them memory, not mockery. But whispers do damage." And one whisper, one shadow, would soon change everything. The Night of Knives on a winter night in 1704. After a performance at Nakamuraza, Deandro was walking home beneath the cover of night. The lamps were few, the streets quiet. He never reached home. Some accounts say he was found in an alleyway, lifeless. Others suggest he staggered into his house, clutching a wound. What we know for certain is this. Ichikawa Deandro, I was stabbed. His blood spilled where footsteps once echoed. He died the next morning. The killer was never formally tried, but rumors spread quickly. Some said it was a jealous rival. Others, a former lover. Still others blamed a low-level censor, enraged at the mixing of holy and profane. But the truth remains, like so much in the floating world half-seen, and the curtain falls. For now, his funeral was enormous. Thousands came. Some from as far as Kyoto. They did not come just for a man. They came for a movement, for a symbol, for a voice now silent. Deandro's son would inherit his name, and so would the next, and the next. The line of Ichikawa Deandro would stretch forward for generations, but none would be the first. None would burn quite as brightly, none would become flame. We end here, in silence, standing beneath a cedar tree in an Edo graveyard, the scent of incense rising like thin smoke into the cold morning air. Let us return to the theater, but years later now, drums beat more softly. The audience is older, and on stage a boy has grown into a man. He wears his father's robe. He takes his father's posture. He speaks his father's lines. He is Ichikawa Deandro too, and tonight he is not merely acting. He is remembering. A name like a temple. In Kabuki, a stage name is more than a title, it is a sacred inheritance. When Deandro I died, his son was barely into adulthood. The boy who had once practiced me in a cold dressing room, copying the thunderous stance of his father, now bore a lineage not just in name, but in expectation. The name Deandro was spoken like a prayer. With it came fame, but also responsibility. Kabuki was not written in stone. It changed with each generation. And now it was the son's task to protect his father's style, while also reshaping its softening edges, adjusting rhythm, making space for new audiences. Deandro too was more refined, less raw. Where his father's heroes shouted with divine rage, the son's warriors moved with contained power. He honored Aragoto, but he also explored Wagoto, the gentler, romantic counterpart. He honored flame, but he did not always become it. Some traditionalists protested, but others saw evolution and inheritance becoming art. The shaping of a school, Narataya, and lineage as craft the Deandro. Name was eventually tied to a yago or acting house Narataya. Like a dojo for martial artists, Narataya became a school not of swordplay, but of stylized gesture. New apprentices joined, sons trained from childhood. Even daughters and servants absorbed the rhythms of kabuki through daily life, how to lace a kimono for dramatic flair, how to raise an eyebrow that carried 3 layers of meaning. Performances were no longer just individual feats. They became multi-generational ceremonies. Imagine the training. A child, barely 5, practicing me for an hour a day. The body must be still, the muscles locked, the expression sharp and divine. A single mistake, blinking at the wrong time, wavering in posture, would be corrected gently, but firmly. Over time, Deandro too passed on not only techniques but a philosophy. That kabuki was not illusion, but an expression of eternal rhythms. Thunder, silence, passion, discipline. These were not acted, they were embodied. Kabuki in the nation's mirror as Deandro II and later successors performed across Japan. Kabuki evolved into more than entertainment. It became a cultural mirror, not just of individual characters, but of societal values. The stylized speech patterns mirrored samurai rhetoric. The revenge tales echoed real court tensions. Even the comic interludes reflected the frustrations and petty grievances of commoners navigating bureaucracy and family life. When a D'Andro performed, the crowd didn't just see a warrior. They saw themselves elevated, their hopes, their griefs, their conflicts, rendered in brocade and lacquered wigs. Over time, the role of Fudu Mayawance, so spiritually charged in D'Andro, the first S-Hands, was adapted for festivals and seasonal performances. Though the religious undercurrent was softer, the symbolic fire still burned. Even in laughter, kabuki preserved reverence, revival, and ritual. The return of D'Andro, the name D'Andro, was passed through generations. Not all successors bore it immediately. Some earned it after decades. Others adopted it ceremonially. It's often in Shmai ceremonies, grand naming rituals attended by actors, patrons, and aristocrats. These rituals were public, theatrical, deeply moving. Names were recited with fanfare. Fans cried. Seasoned actors bowed. Each Shmai was a moment of rebirth, a handing of the torch, the acceptance of memory's weight. By the time of Ichikawa D'Andro, the 7th in the early 19th century, the name had become a national treasure. This D'Andro reintroduced many of his ancestors' works, reviving classic Aragoto performances and even restoring some of D'Andro's original religious symbolism. He brought back Fudu Myo. He restaged the plays of the Golden Age. In doing so, he reconnected kabuki with its spiritual roots. Even the sound of his voice was said to echo the original. In death, in dust, in motion. Now let us return to a quiet place offstage, behind the curtain, where the actors remove their makeup in silence. The white powder, once brilliant, now fades like chalk in soft light. The wig is lifted, the sword laid down. The actor's feet ache from the posture, the weight of the day's ceremony pressing into every tendon. And then the ritual begins again. The costumes are folded with reverence. The incense is lit. The next generation prepares to bow. And the echoes of D'Andro, I drift like threads through silk sleeves and quiet footsteps. Kabuki, like history, is not linear. It circles. It repeats. It is memory in motion. And even now, centuries later, D'Andro's gestures remain a bent knee, a clenched fist, a flash of the eyes, a flash of flame. And so ends the tale of Ichikawa D'Andro, I first among his line, last of his kind, both man and mirror. His life, brief yet blazing, shaped centuries of theater, identity, and performance in Japan. We step now, softly, away from the bright noise of the kabuki stage, past the paper lanterns, past the folded silks, past the echo of applause. Ahead lies something quieter still, stone and wind, snow and salt, a forgotten island, a place of exile and poetry and silence. Imagine the sound of waves, not the crash of a storm, but the low, persistent hush of winter tide. Cold wind brushes your sleeves. The boat beneath you creaks. And beyond the mist, there is an island, not tropical, not lush, but solemn. An island with a past. You are bound for Seto Island off the northwest coast of Honshu, not as a traveler, not as a merchant, but as an exile. The year is sometime in the early 13th century, perhaps 1221 or 1272. Dates blur on the long crossing. You have been sentenced not to death, but to erasure. And here, on this island, Japan sends those it wishes to forget. It's a distant land within the realm. Seto Island is not far in terms of geography, perhaps. A few dozen miles from Nagatabut, in the imagination of court and city dwellers, it might as well be another world. It is wind-beaten. Its soil is poor. Its winters are cruel. And yet it is not a prison. There are no bars, no shackles, just isolation, distance, and the sense that the world has turned its back. During the Heian and Kamakura periods, Seto became a favored site of banishment and for criminals of violence, but for thinkers, writers, monks, and nobles who had stepped too far out of favor. The punishment was subtle, yet total. You are alive, but your rank is gone. Your voice no longer reaches the capital. Your poems, if you write them, will not be copied. It is not death, but it is exile. The snow, the salt, the silence. Let your mind wander to a village on Sato's coast. Simple homes of thatch and wood huddle against the wind. Smoke curls from chimneys. Inside, silence. No drama, no ceremony, just daily survival. The sea provides what it can. Shellfish, seaweed, occasionally fish. The land gives little, some millet, some root vegetables. There is no rice to spare. And so, the exiled monk once draped in silk, once surrounded by acolytes, now walks barefoot through snow to collect firewood. A former courtier learns how to mend a fishing net. Former poet barters verses for a bowl of barley. Real lives in real cold. Exile is ritual. Among the most famous exiles to Seto was Emperor Juntoku, deposed after the GKU War in 1221. A former sovereign, now reduced to walking in the shadow of fishermen. His days were filled with writing, prayer, and endless longing. Another was Nichiren, a Buddhist monk whose bold denunciations of rival sects earned him not execution, but expulsion. He arrived on Seto in 1271, expecting death by exposure or violence. Instead, he survived, prayed, wrote letters, converted farmers, argued theology with anyone who would listen. To be exiled to Seto was not merely punishment, it was ritual purification through harshness, shedding of prestige, a test of endurance, a form of spiritual pilgrimage without movement. And in the absence of city noise and imperial pageantry, these exiles often turned inward. Seto as a mirror time on the island passed differently. Without court schedules or festival calendars, one began to mark time by tides, the length of snow cover, the blossoming of weeds. The rhythms of Seto were not dictated by power, but by nature. This had strange effects on those sent there. Some broke, some withered in silence. But others began to write, deeply, slowly, profoundly. Not for fame, for there would be none, but for clarity. A poet's verse scratched into birch bark, a monk's chant carried over frozen hills, a noble's diary bound with string and salt-crusted fingers. They were not meant to survive, and yet many did. The boat that brought you to Seto is long gone now. The path back to the capital is sealed. Your name may still be spoken, but only in whispers. And yet, on this island of salt and silence, a different kind of voice begins to emerge. A voice tempered by hardship, strengthened by solitude, made soft by snow. Let us settle in again. The sea remains restless beyond the shoreline of Seto, a dull hush behind the hills. The skies are gray more often than not. Winter here lasts longer than memory, and yet, within this cold expanse, something fragile, luminous, and enduring begins to stir. Words not shouted, not proclaimed, but carefully chosen, carefully recorded. Let's explore the voices that rose in exile, sometimes quietly, sometimes defiantly, from Seto Island. The exiled emperor. Juntoku's lament. Begin. With a name still known in imperial genealogies, but largely absent from popular history. Emperor Juntoku ascended the throne in 1210, reigned through a time of political turbulence, and was deposed in the aftermath of the JQ War. His crime? Supporting his father's attempt to restore imperial authority and curb the power of the Kamakura shogunate. His punishment, perpetual exile to Seto Island. He was 25. Imagine the change not just of scenery, but of being. From court halls painted in vermilion and trimmed with gold, to a shack of weather-beaten wood on an island where no one bows to your title anymore. Here Juntoku was not sovereign. He was a fallen figure, and he knew it. He turned to poetry. Many of his waka verses survive, quiet, aching, and haunted by cold. One might read, on this distant isle, where I wear no robes of state, only winter's bite. Even snow seems less pure than the silence of my disgrace. His verses rarely rail against his fate. Instead, they observe the way snowflakes fall, the way birds vanish in autumn, it's the way loneliness feels thick enough to touch. He lived like this for over 2 decades. When he died, it was not in a palace, but in exile, wrapped in the garments of a commoner, a man whose poems lived longer than his reign. Nichiren on the windswept coast. Now shift to a different kind of figure, a man whose voice never softened, even in banishment. Nichiren, a Buddhist priest born in 1222, was not a political rebel, but a religious one. He believed fervently in the power of the Lotus Sutra and denounced other sects for leading the people astray. The authorities were not pleased. After warnings and arrests, he was sentenced to exile on Seto in 1271, a harsher form of punishment than earlier assignments to provincial temples. Here, on the cold edge of the world, he was thrown into conditions meant to break him. Poverty, snow, isolation, hostility from locals, but Nichiren thrived. In this hardship, his teachings crystallized. He wrote some of his most powerful treatises from a wind-battered hut, addressing followers who would never see him again. Though the snow piles high and wolves cry upon the wind, the truth does not fade. Even stones whisper Dharma when all else is taken. His followers copied his letters by hand, sending them across the land. A few reached the mainland. Some were read aloud in secret. Nichiren did not just endure Seto. He transformed it into a pulpit. His exile became a symbol of unshakable faith. Eventually he was released. But the island had changed him. From Seto, he had looked into the abyss and had spoken back. Common lives, uncommon words. The famous are remembered. But what of the others? For every emperor or priest exiled to Seto, there were dozens of minor nobles, scholars, scribes, and monks whose names are lost, but whose voices, now and then, flicker through the past. In small notebooks bound in rice straw, in graffiti scratched into walls of abandoned shrines, in poems found tucked in prayer scrolls, one anonymous exile wrote, "Even if I leave, who will know I was ever here on this island? I carved my name in driftwood, not for history, but for wind." Another, "A priest brought me broth, seaweed tangled like my thoughts, salted with pity. I thanked him with a haiku that he will forget by spring." These are not declarations. They are echo-soft, deeply human, and sometimes heartbreaking. A living grave. In time, Seto Island began to be seen not just as punishment, but as a kind of living grave. A final place of solitude, where memory flickered faintly and then was lost. For some, like Juntoku, it became the landscape of their entire adult life. For others, like Nichiren, it was an ordeal, a crucible. And yet, within the sorrow, a strange freedom emerged. On Seto, no one watched your every word. No one demanded flattery or pretended decorum. You could write as you were, think as you were, grieve as you were. And for a few, this freedom gave birth to a depth of thought they might never have reached in comfort. Now, night begins to fall over Seto. The wind quiets. Smoke rises from a few humble hearths. In the stillness, you might hear the rustling of brush a poet rearranging words by candlelight, a monk muttering prayers over waves. We will explore the later history of the island, its mines, its laborers, and the slow transformation from exile to exploitation. What began as a place of punishment would, in time, become a place of profit, and its silence would be broken by hammers and bells. You've arrived at a quiet familiarity with the wind and snow of Seto Island. You've wandered its ragged coasts alongside exiled emperors, scribes, and monks. You've tasted the salt in their verses and traced the threads of memory that still flutter in its forests. But now, we must let go of poetry for a while, 'cause Seto changed. And where once it was a place of forgotten voices, it would become a place of relentless labor. Gold beneath the earth, the transformation began, not with politics, but with geology. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, long after the exiles of Juntoku and Nichiren faded into legend's Seto-S hills, revealed a secret: gold. And not merely scattered flakes or whispered veins, but abundant reserves, tucked beneath its mountains. To the Tokugawa shogunate, newly consolidating its grip on Japan, this was no mere curiosity. It was a strategic resource, a vital artery for economic stability, a source of coins, salaries, power. And so Seto, once a backwater of sorrow, was brought into the beating heart of the shogunal state. The mines of Ikawa picture a valley carved into stone. Ikawa gold and silver mine, Eventually, the most important on the island became an enormous industrial complex by the standards of its time. By the early 1600s, tens of thousands of workers were laboring in the mountain's shadow. They dug, hammered, hauled, and smelted. Sedo's once quiet forests echoed with the ring of tools and the grunts of labor. Imagine yourself now, not as an exile, but as a mine worker, sent to Sedo not for crimes of speech, but for debts, birth, or misfortune. You descend into a shaft, lit only by dim oil lamps. The air is thick with dust. Your lungs fill with dampness. The walls are narrow, the ceiling low. Water seeps through cracks and drips onto your shoulders. You work bent for hours. You carry stones and baskets slung across your back. You are paid just enough to eat, if that. And always, the mountain breathes slowly, dangerously. Cavins are common, accidents frequent, illness constant. You are no longer forgotten, but you are also no longer free. Punishment transformed into labor, it's important to understand. Exile did not end when the mines began. Rather, exile evolved. Now, Sedo was not a place to silence the educated, but to use the unwanted. Criminals, outcasts, peasants, accused of theft or rebellion were sent to Sedo to work in the mines. Some came in chains, others by choice, seeking work. But once here, few left. The island became a gray zone between prison and factory, punishment and production. And the tools of hardship were not silence and cold, but exhaustion and monotony. Ghosts of the past still, even amidst the clamor of mine shafts and refineries, the ghosts of the exiled past remained. Mine workers on rare evenings of rest might huddle around a fire and whisper about the poet emperor, or about the priest who refused to yield. Some claim that Nikieren's cave, where he meditated during his exile, still echoed with his voice on cold nights. Some left offerings, their pebbles, coins, scraps of rice. A few illiterate laborers would bring scribes and ask them to write waka poems for them, simply to recite in solitude. Even amidst toil, memory lingered. Sedo in the late Edo period, by the 18th century, the mines began to decline. The richest veins were tapped, costs rose, accidents multiplied. Now there were fewer workers, fewer overseers. The great boom was over, and yet Sedo had been changed permanently. It was no longer only an island of exile, nor simply an outpost of labor. It had become a microcosm of Tokugawa Japan itself, a place where authority, silence, hardship, and devotion all collided. Temples stood alongside smelters, songs of fishermen mixed with the clang of hammers. Wind still carried the scent of pine, but now also sulfur. As time passed, the poetry returned. A humble shrine was built to house the spirit of Juntoku. Pilgrims came to pray where he had once walked. Nikieren's hut became a sacred site. Monks meditated in its shadow. Former laborers, their backs bent, and voices low, sometimes whispered verses to the sea. The Sedo of memory. Today, Sedo Island is quiet again. The mines are no longer active. The shafts are now museums. Nikieren's writings are preserved in temples. The names of the exiles are etched in plaques, their verses carved in stone. But the wind has not changed, nor has the snow, nor has the deep, low silence that still seems to stretch across the fields in winter. If you were to visit Sedo today, not as a prisoner or laborer, but as a traveler, you might walk its paths and feel something old beneath your steps, a pause, a hush, kind of reverent distance from the noise of the world. And perhaps, in that quiet, you would hear it again. Even the exiled, though stripped of name and station, leave their echo here, the wind, the stone, a voice that was not erased. Sedo Island reminds us that exile is not merely absence, and labor not merely toil. They are experiences that reshape the soul, sometimes breaking it, sometimes refining it. And though most who were sent to Sedo never returned, their thoughts did, in ink, in verse. In our final segment, we will leave the cold coasts behind and step into the carefully composed world of Tokugawa power where authority whispered through rituals. And the most powerful men in Japan ruled not by shouting but by remaining silent. A still world begins. Imagine waking not to sound, but to a silence so carefully constructed it hums with tension. This is the stillness of Edo Castle at first light, a place not ruled by noise or haste, but by the ritualized gravity of power. The day of a Tokugawa shogun does not begin like yours might. There is no clamor of alarm, no rush to coffee or news. Instead, there is a slow unfurling, a room without clocks, paper screens that filter in the pale light of morning, tatami that silences every footstep. Every movement, every breath exists within an ordered choreography that has not changed for generations. And somewhere in the center of it all, barely visible behind sliding walls, behind attendants and protocols, the shogun is already awake.
Wow.
The palace as a body. Edo Castle is not just a residence, it is a living organism, a reflection of state control. Its hundreds of rooms, galleries, and gates are arranged in layers of increasing seclusion. You, as a common visitor, would never pass beyond the outermost layers. As a mid-level daimyo, you might be admitted to an anteroom as a high-ranking courtier. You might be allowed into the Shiro Shoinet's public audience chamber, spare and magnificent. But only a precious few would ever approach the Okagata, the shogun's private quarters. Each room reflects not the personality of the man who rules Japan, but the ideology of Tokugawa rule: stability, restraint, hierarchy. The walls speak not of emotion, but of continuity. Even the floors are built to sing softly, nightingale floors designed to chirp faintly underfoot, alerting guards to the presence of intruders without ever needing a spoken word. Here, sound is a luxury. Silence is the norm. The shogun's morning ritual: the shogun begins his morning slowly and always under observation. Servants attend to his grooming not flamboyantly, but precisely. Hair is arranged in the top-knot style appropriate to his rank. Ritual cleansing is performed with reverent exactness. Clothing is not simply worn, it is layered, folded, tied in accordance with strict protocols. Each robe carries meaning. Colors and fabrics are selected according to season, status, and symbolism. A summer robe of pale blue silk, a winter garment of subdued charcoal, a touch of gold thread, never gaudy, but present. He does not speak, not yet. Others do not speak unless addressed. Even here, surrounded by aides and stewards, the shogun's authority is most powerful when least expressed. He is not theatrical, not emotive. His presence is felt, not declared. The first audience by mid-morning, the first audience begins. Picture the omote, shoin, the audience chamber. It is large, sparsely adorned and intimidating. The room is designed to convey distance, both physical and social. Visitors remain several meters away, seated in kneeling position on polished tatami. They speak from the floor, never rising unless instructed. The shogun sits elevated, not only on a platform, but metaphorically above all present. He listens. He rarely interrupts. His voice, when used, is low, measured. Not a command, but a decision, a nod, a pause, a gesture. You would not last long here, not for lack of intelligence, but for the quiet strain of endless self-containment. Every sentence you utter is weighed. Every reaction is noted. You must never raise your eyes too freely. You must never forget that every part of this space is a reflection of power structured over centuries, the inner quarters. Women of the Joku, beyond the public chambers, lies a more secretive realm, the Joku, or Great Interior. This is the section of the castle occupied by the shogun's wives, concubines, female attendants, and their retainers. A self-contained world where no adult men save the shogun himself may enter. The Joku is often misunderstood in modern imagination as a place of leisure or intrigue. In truth, it was a site of political tension, subtle negotiation, and complex hierarchy. Women here lived by their own codes, by rules as strict as any found in the outer chambers. Some were born to noble houses. Others were selected for beauty, talent, or connections. All were subject to elaborate internal ranking, and all lived in a kind of golden cage. The shogun would occasionally visit, but rarely in haste. His presence disrupted nothing. It was always expected, always arranged. Children born here might one day ascend to political influence or be kept from public life entirely. Even joy in the Joku was carefully regulated. The midday respite as the sun reaches its zenith. The palace remains cool and dim. The architecture is designed to control light and heat. Screens diffuse sunlight. Wooden eaves cast deliberate shadows. Corridors remain in a state of gentle hush. The shogun may take a quiet meal, served with ceremony, consumed with restraint. He does not feast, he dines. Food is prepared by elite chefs. Each dish is seasonal, balanced, symbolic. A sprig of pine atop a lacquered bowl of rice. Soup flavored with subtle miso, not overpowering. Fish, never greasy. Pickled vegetables arranged in careful harmony of color and taste. Every bite reflects a philosophy that power is best expressed through self-mastery. Afternoon governance, though calm, the afternoon is not idle. The shogun confers with his regger, the senior counselors of the Bakufu government. They discuss land disputes, taxation, domain succession, foreign trade. Maps are unrolled, scrolls are read aloud. But decisions are often made in the gaps between speech. Silence is not avoidance. Hear it is deliberation. To be a Tokugawa shogun is to live in a continuous state of measured stillness, always in control, never rushed. Orders are issued not as barked commands, but as elegantly phrased instructions. It's usually conveyed through intermediaries and always documented. By late afternoon, these councils dissolve. Visitors leave. Palace breathes a little more freely. But the atmosphere never relaxes. Because the man at the center of it all, the shogun must never be seen relaxing. His dignity is not only personal, it is symbolic. A nation depends upon his stillness. The sunset quiet as evening approaches. The castle dims even further. Candles and lanterns are lit, not for illumination, but for ambience. Their glow is soft, diffuse. Gold leaf panels catch the light. Scrolls cast shadows. The shogun may walk quietly through a garden corridor. Perhaps he visits a bonsai grove, a koi pond, a moon viewing pavilion. But always, his walk is observed. Attendants maintain distance, but never vanish. He is never alone, not truly. He may write a verse, rare private. He may read. He may meditate. But more often he simply watches. Listens. Exists. It is not a life of freedom, but it is a life of careful perfection. Ceremony as sovereignty in Tokugawa, Japan. Governance was not merely a matter of law or sword, it was theater. It's not a theater of chaos or spectacle, but a measured, sacred choreography where every step, every breath, every folding screen and ink-drawn scroll served a role in sustaining the illusion of immutable control. The shogun did not merely govern, he appeared to govern without haste, without emotion, and with the gravitas of a mountain unmoved by time. Every ritual was a mirror of power, reflected not in noise but in structure. The daimyo processions. Echoes of control imagined standing along the wide, stone-lined streets of Edo in the early morning. You hear it before you see it. A slow rhythm of footfalls, fabric brushing armor, horses softly snorting, the distant clatter of wooden sandals against cobblestone. The air smells faintly of pine smoke and old lacquer. The people around you are silent, heads bowed, backs straight. A daimyo procession is passing. These were not casual visits. These were mandated acts of loyalty, required by the Tokugawa system of Sankenketa, the alternate attendance system. Every powerful landholder, every regional lord, was required to spend part of the year in Edo under the shogun's watchful gaze, often leaving their families behind as hostages to peace. The processions were slow and grand, sometimes involving hundreds of attendants. Flags, armored retainers, palanquins, musicians, and guards. But they were not for entertainment. They were reminders. Each footfall a signal that the nation's lords were not independent. They revolved around the still center, the shogun, shogunal procession. When the stillness moves on rare occasions, the shogun himself would travel. His procession was unlike any other, was not simply large, it was an embodiment of the state. Picture it, thousands of participants, layers of guards, cavalry, musicians playing soft percussive patterns, clerks carrying scrolls, priests bearing symbols of divine authority, giant red umbrellas, gold-flecked banners, lanterns even in daylight. And at the center, hidden from view, the palanquin of the shogun. He did not wave, he did not speak. He was not seen, because true power did not need to be visible. The procession's perfections, the still expressions, the matching uniforms, the exact spacing was the message. The country was not ruled by force, it was held in place by form. The audience of the New Year, perhaps the most potent symbol of this system, was the New Year's audience, a moment not of joy or festivity, but of ritual reaffirmation. At dawn on the first day of the year, snow often still fresh upon the rooftops, the senior daimyo and officials would gather in Edo Castle. They dressed in formal, court-attire-lured silks, swords properly mounted, movements carefully rehearsed. They entered the great hall in silence. At the far end, elevated and immobile, the shogun waited. His garments were austere, black silk, silver embroidery, a family crest repeated like a gentle mantra. One by one, the lords would approach. They bowed once, deeply, then again lower, and a third time, until their foreheads nearly brushed the tatami. No words were exchanged beyond the formal greetings. But in these bows measured, humble, identical, the hierarchy of Japan was reinscribed year after year. Gift-giving and hierarchy gifts played a central role in shogunal ritual, not as personal tokens, but as formal, coded messages. The shogun might bestow a folding screen painted by a famous artist, a sword passed through generations, a roll of fine Nara silk, a rare incense from the south, not excessive, but significant. The recipient would bow low, accept the item with practiced reverence, and respond in kind with offerings carefully chosen to acknowledge status without overreaching. Each gift was registered by scribes, each act remembered. To you, such ritual might feel exhausting. To the Tokugawa elite, it was the architecture of peace. The art of remaining still much of a shogun's authority was built not on what he did, but on what he did not do. He did not raise his voice. He did not weep in public, did not touch freely. He did not react without reason. This emotional stillness was not emptiness. It was discipline. Imagine being always watched. Every blink, every posture, every hesitation read for meaning. In council, the shogun might sit for hours, listening. Only at the end would he speak. Perhaps 3 words. Perhaps a question. Perhaps nothing at all. And yet all decisions flowed from that moment of silence. This is why you wouldn't last a day in such a role, not because you lack intelligence, but because the absence of expression would wear at your nerves. In modern life, we prize spontaneity, vulnerability, speech, but in the shogunal court, to speak without need was to leak power. Religious duties and sacred distance, the Tokugawa shogun was not a god, but he stood at the apex of the cosmic order. He patronized temples, commissioned shrines, conducted rituals to pacify spirits and honor ancestors. He did not perform miracles, but he maintained balance. On key dates, he would attend Buddhist ceremonies, not to seek enlightenment, but to demonstrate fidelity to divine harmony. Monks would chant for hours in low, melodic tones. Incense would drift like memory through the eaves. Offerings would be made quietly, precisely. The shogun would sit, eyes lowered, breathing steady. He was not an emperor. He did not claim divinity. But he carried the responsibility of perfection, to be the man who held the world in place by never changing expression. The masks of portraiture, even portraits of the shogun, were designed not to capture his personality, but to erase it. Look at the surviving images from the era. You won't find smiling faces or casual dress. You'll see layered robes, serene expressions, abstracted backgrounds. The shogun does not sit in a lively room, but in an imagined space of blank void where nothing distracts from his imperturbability. Art, too, was part of the theater. The Tokugawa cultivated poetry, painting, tea ceremony, not as indulgences, but as states of controlled refinement. The shogun's brush might compose a haikanot to reveal emotion, but to reinforce his philosophical distance. A still pond. Even the frog's jump echoes centuries.
Ow.
Evening once again. As the sun fades over Edo, the castle darkens once more. There is no dramatic ending, no curtain fall. The guards' chains shift in silence. The corridors are swept. The lanterns flicker. The shogun returns to his private quarters. He does not celebrate the day's successes. He does not record his feelings in a diary. He simply remains, Because the greatest fear of the Tokugawa regime was not invasion or famine or rebellion. It was unpredictability. And so the shogun must be the constant center. The man who never blinks, who never falters, who never leaves the script. Even in sleep, he is watched over by order. In our final part, we will step back to understand how this structure of power, this polished kami, eventually began to crack. We'll trace the quiet unraveling of this serene facade as foreign ships appear, economic tensions grow, and the man behind the mask of power must confront the sound of a world changing. A quiet system, slowly strained. The Tokugawa shogunate had ruled for over 2 centuries, not through the chaos of conquest or the noise of ceaseless battle, but through the cultivation of stillness, through orderly rituals, through precisely calibrated silence, and through the predictable rhythm of a world held in place. But even the most carefully composed painting cannot withstand the slow accumulation of time. And even in Edo Castle, with its gold leaf walls and sliding doors that sang softly with every opening, the tremors of a changing world began to stir. These tremors at first were so quiet you might not notice them. A daimyo returning from Edo slightly less lavish than before, a merchant family rising faster than an old samurai house, a rice price that did not recover, a letter delivered in secret bearing foreign symbols. The center still appeared calm, but the outer ripples grew restless. The economy that outgrew its frame, the Tokugawa system, was designed to preserve a fixed hierarchy. The shogun ruled. The daimyo served. The samurai stood above, while peasants grew rice, artisans made goods, and merchants at the very bottom circulated wealth without status. But wealth, as it tends to do, began to disobey these categories. Merchants, through clever investment and sprawling networks of trade, grew increasingly rich, not just in coins, but in influence financing festivals, patronizing kabuki, even funding temples and debts of noble houses. Meanwhile, many samurai, bound by a strict code and a fixed stipend, found themselves gradually impoverished. A samurai might walk the streets in fine robes, but owe more than he earned. A merchant might bow low as custom required, but secretly own half the warehouses in the ward. This inversion was corrosive not immediately, but inevitably. You can imagine the strain it introduced into rituals once held in perfect balance. The gift given to the shogun, now funded by a moneylender. The audience in court, where everyone knows the man in silk cannot pay his servants. Still, the shogunate insisted on form over flux. They tightened the rituals, increased inspections, strengthened censorship. But behind the quiet, the pressure built. The ships that broke the horizon, and then, in 1853, the silence of Edo Harbor was broken. Black ships, foreign steam-powered vessels, appeared on the sea like omens of another world. Commodore Matthew Perry, of the United States Navy, demanded entry, demanded trade, demanded Japan open. The shogunate, built upon the illusion of complete control, was now faced with a choice for which no ritual existed. There had been foreign contact before, of course. The Dutch had quietly traded through Dejima. Chinese traders had passed through Nagasaki. But this was not quiet. This was cannon fire into the sky. The people of Edo watched the ships with a mixture of awe, fear, and curiosity. Some believed them to be floating castles, others harbingers of the end. The court held emergency councils, and the shogun, that still figure at the center of all, now had to decide. He stalled. He issued polite refusals. He commissioned translations. He asked the daimyo for their thoughts, many of whom gave different answers. There was no ritual for this. Eventually, he agreed. Ports would open. The world so long held at a respectful ritual distance would now step inside. Discontent from within the cracks widened. Reformers from within the samurai class began to challenge the old order. They admired the strength of foreign powers, envied their ships and sciences, and questioned the old ways. Some daimyo grew bold, building their own modern armies, their own navies. The emperor, long a symbolic figure, became a new focus for legitimacy. Quiet voices began to speak of restoration, of returning power to the throne in Kyoto. Riots stirred in villages. Famine deepened. Scholars translated forbidden texts. And the merchants, always quiet, began to fund movement. The Tokugawa still performed the rites. The gifts still changed hands. The audiences still occurred. The shogun still sat in silence. But outside the walls, the country had moved on. The shogun who could not hold still in 1867, Tokugawa Yoshinobuta, last shogun, stood at a crossroads. He was intelligent, well-read, aware of the deepening crisis. And unlike his predecessors, he no longer believed that stillness alone could govern. He tried to reform. He tried to build a modern state. He attempted to reconcile tradition with innovation. But it was too late. The illusion had fractured. The mask of eternal calm could no longer hold back the storm, and so in a final act of measured humility, he resigned. He handed back power to the emperor. Voluntarily, calmly, without bloodshed at first. The Meiji Restoration had begun. The shogunatan institution of order, of silence, of ritualized permanence, had ended. After silence, reflections, the Tokugawa shogunate did not fall with a dramatic crash. There was no climactic battle in the heart of Edo Castle, no assassination beneath golden screens. It faded like incense after a ceremony, slowly, respectfully, leaving only memory out. And in this, perhaps, it succeeded. Its purpose had never been to last forever. Its purpose had been to hold still the wheel of history for as long as possible. For over 250 years, it had done so through tea, through silence, through bows and scrolls and rooms painted in golden shadow. But no stillness lasts forever. And in that final bow, the Tokugawa left behind not just a political system, but a way of being an echo of quiet authority. A memory of power held with restraint and a cautionary whisper about the limits of ritual in a world that always moves. Wouldn't tea last a day in the court of a Tokugawa shogun, not because of the danger or the drama, but because of the weight of stillness. Because silence, when it holds an entire country in place, is not peace. It is responsibility. It is vigilance. It is the long, exhausting task of appearing unshaken forever. And so we close our final segment in quiet reflection. You've traveled from the stench and labor of Edo's sewer workers to the painted stage of Kabuki's first star. You've wandered the exiled winds of Seto Island, and now walk the carpeted halls of a shogun's invisible rule. History, like sleep, is not always loud. Sometimes it is a quiet ritual, a steady footstep, a face behind a fan. Sometimes it whispers not to awaken you, but to let you drift. Final closing. Imagine for a moment how far you've traveled tonight, not in distance, but in rhythm, in scent, in silence. You began in the darkness of Edo's streetswear. Quiet feet padded through alleys carrying night soil, and laborers moved through the underside of a society that rarely thanked them. Their burden was both literal and social, yet without them, the great city could not breathe. They were the hidden spine of Edo, odorless in history books, but ever present in truth. It rose then with the clamor of Kabuki. With Ichikawa D'Andro, eye in his painted face, his booming voice, his scandal and spectacle. Through him, you saw how Japan played with shadow and identity, how even in a highly ordered world, performance could offer freedom. Under the fan, behind the mask, entire lives could unfold. Then you turned your gaze outward to the sea wind of exile, to Seto Island, cold and mistrapped, a place of punishment, of isolation, of slow time. There, rebels and monks, poets and dissidents stood against the current or drifted away from it. Their footsteps still echo across gravel paths, and their words etched in stone or memories still rise like morning fog. And finally, you stepped into gold-lit halls, into the still center of the Tokugawa shogunate. You stood where power did not shout, but merely looked, where control was a folding screen, and peace was a performance executed with great care. You watched as silence held a nation still for centuries, until it no longer could. And now, here you are, in the stillness of your own room. The air is modern. The lights dimmed. Your world perhaps quieter than before. You might never carry a night bucket through the alleys of Edo. You might never don the thick robes of a kabuki actor. You might never kneel on a cold island shore or bow before a silent shogun. But these lives, these places, they are with you now. Not as stories, not as lessons, but as a kind of companion in rest. They remind you that every society has its hidden workers, its masked performers, its exiles, and its rulers cloaked in ritual. And they remind you that time moves like a slow tide, and that rest, true rest, comes not only from stillness, but from understanding. So breathe now, deeply, or let the lanterns of Edo fade into dusk. Let the sea winds of Cedo grow softer. Let the applause of the theater dim to a hush. Let the golden halls fall silent once more. You are safe. You are far from the burden of buckets and the scrutiny of courts. Here, there is no duty, no mask to wear, no exile to endure, no ritual to perform. Only rest, only quiet. Only the long, slow drift into sleep carried gently, like a poem across the water.